Today we're going over Chapter 12 of A People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn. Chapter 12 is titled The Empire and the People. Before we get in, for those of you who have recently purchased a copy, would you mind just commenting where you found a copy? Because there are a few folks who are trying to find it, and it seems to be sold out in some places and not in others. So if you could just take a few moments to help those people out, that would be greatly appreciated. I do have headphones in today because there's construction happening underneath my apartment, in front of my apartment, and behind my apartment. And so for the sake of keeping this series going, I'm trying to drown out the noise so that it's not overwhelming for you and for me. And so it might come across a little bit differently today in terms of audio, but hopefully it's doable. I'm trying to work with what I got. Chapter 12, like I alluded to in the last video, is where we are going to see just how hungry the United States was and is to dominate foreign lands. Places that they honestly have no business being in, but because they see dollar signs everywhere, they will impose themselves, they will entrench themselves into these communities, into these countries, and they will do whatever they need to do in order to make sure that they get what they want. And that is not surprising. I'm not telling you something that you don't know already. This is just the beginning. This is just the beginning, okay? We're going to talk about Cuba. We're going to talk about the Philippines. More importantly, we're going to talk about the psychology of the American capitalists in this time. Late 1800s, early 1900s. What are the American politicians thinking? What are the American capitalists thinking? They're thinking money, they're thinking workers, they're thinking dominance, they're thinking about exploring uncharted territory, mining from places that have been untouched, and war. Because, as we know, war is the perfect way to get people on the inside to stop talking. And like we know now from all of the chapters up until this point, rebellion was this close. Always. Always. So, before the Civil War, what was happening? Right now, before the Spanish-American War, what's happening? Parallels, always. Common denominators, always. Patterns, always. Okay? That's the intro. We're going to get into this. And also, no. I'm just going to start the next video. Okay, so American imperialism. Shall we get into it? Are you ready? Theodore Roosevelt wrote to a friend in the year 1897, "In strict confidence, I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." These people are psychotic. These people are psychotic, and the people today are also psychotic. All of them. The year of the massacre at Wounded Knee, 1890, it was officially declared by the Bureau of the Census that the internal frontier was closed. The profit system, with its natural tendency for expansion, had already begun to look overseas. The severe depression that began in 1893 strengthened an idea of developing within the political and financial elite of the country, that overseas markets for American goods might relieve the problem of underconsumption at home and prevent the economic crisis that, in the 1890s, brought class war. And would not a foreign adventure deflect some of the rebellious energy that went into strikes and protest movements toward an external enemy? Would it not unite people with government, with the armed forces, instead of against them? This was probably not a conscious plan among most of the elite, but a natural development from the twin drives of capitalism and nationalism. Expansion overseas was not a new idea. There was more than thinking. The American armed forces had made forays overseas. A State Department list instances of the use of U.S. armed forces abroad, 1798 to 1945, presented by Secretary of State Dean Rusk to a Senate committee in 1862 to cite precedents for the use of armed force against Cuba, shows 103 interventions in the affairs of other countries between 1798 and 1895. A sampling from this list, with the exact description given by the State Department, goes as follows. 1852 to 1853, Argentina. 1853, Nicaragua. 1853 to 1854, Japan. 1854, Nicaragua. 1855, Uruguay. 1859, China. 1860, Angola, Portuguese West Africa. 1893, Hawaii. And then here it has the description of why they justified going to these places. So if you have the book, you'll see there. Psychotic. The ideology of expansion was widespread in the upper circles of military men, politicians, businessmen, and even among some of the leaders of farmers' movements who thought foreign markets could help them. You guys don't want to hear this, but you have to hear this. This is what Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts had to say when thinking about going to war outside of the United States. In the interest of our commerce, we should build the Nicaragua Canal, and for the protection of that canal, and for the sake of our commercial supremacy in the Pacific, we should control the Hawaiian Islands and maintain our influence in Samoa. And when the Nicaragua Canal is built, the island of Cuba will become a necessity. The great nations are rapidly absorbing for their future expansion and their present defense all the waste places of the earth. It is a movement which makes for civilization and the advancement of the race. As one of the great nations of the world, the United States must not fall out of the line of march. A Washington Post editorial on the eve of the Spanish-American War said, this is so hard to read, bro. It's just so hard to read this because all of these opinions and thoughts built a culture and an attitude within the United States that has negatively impacted millions of people across the globe in a way that is still present today. And it's just so obvious that the men who led all of these horrible movements were motivated by the worst elements of humanity, to be quite honest with you. A new consciousness seems to have come upon us, the consciousness of strength, and with it a new appetite, the yearning to show our strength, ambition, interest, land hunger, pride, the mere joy of fighting. Whatever it may be, we are animated by a new sensation. We are face to face with a strange destiny. The taste of empire is in the mouth of the people, even as the taste of blood in the jungle. What? Was that taste in the mouth of the people through some instinctive lust for aggression or some urgent self-interest? Or was it a taste, if indeed it existed, created, encouraged, advertised, and exaggerated by the millionaire press, the military, the government, the eager to please scholars of the time? Political scientist John Burgess of Columbia University said the Teutonic and Anglo-Saxon races were particularly endowed with the capacity for establishing national states. They are entrusted with the mission of conducting the political civilization of the modern world. Columbia University! This is a guy who was a political scientist there, the roots of that place. Several years before his election to the presidency, William McKinley said, "We want a foreign market for our surplus products." Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana in early 1897 declared, "American factories are making more than the American people can use. American soils producing more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours." When the United States did not annex Hawaii in 1893 after some Americans, in parentheses, the combined missionary and pineapple interests of the Dole family, Dole, D-O-L-E, close parentheses, set up their government, Roosevelt called the hesitancy a crime against white civilization. These people are fucking nuts, bro. These people are crazy. He told the Naval War College, "All the great masterful races have been fighting races. No triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumph of war." Roosevelt was contemptuous of races and nations he considered inferior. When a mob in New Orleans lynched a number of Italian immigrants, privately he wrote his sister that he thought the lynching was rather a good thing. And he said as much at a dinner with various Dago diplomats, all wrought up by the lynching. William James, the philosopher who became one of the leading anti-imperialists of his time, wrote about Roosevelt that he gushes over war as the ideal condition of human society for the manly strenuouses which it involves, and treats peace as a condition of blubber-like and swollen ignobility, fit only for huckstering weaklings dwelling in gray twilight and heedless of the higher life. While it was true that in 1898, 90% of American products were sold at home, the 10% sold abroad amounted to $1 billion. Oil became a big export in the 1880s and 1890s. By 1891, the Rockefeller family's Standard Oil Company accounted for 90% of American exports of kerosene and controlled 70% of the world market. Oil was now second to cotton as the leading product sent overseas. there were demands for expansion by large commercial farmers. Such an appeal would be especially strong if the expansion looked like an act of generosity, helping a rebellious group overthrow foreign rule. So basically, the United States was trying to get farmers to believe that them going overseas would be a great thing because farmers were not even making that much money, and it was like, oh, this is an opportunity for y'all to make more money, Such an appeal would be especially strong if the expansion looked like an act of generosity, helping a rebellious group overthrow foreign rule, as in Cuba. By 1898, Cuban rebels had been fighting their Spanish conquerors for 3 years in an attempt to win independence. By that time, it was possible to create a national mood for intervention. It seems that the business interests of the nation did not at first want military intervention in Cuba. American merchants did not need colonies or wars of conquest if they could just have free access to markets. This idea of an open door became the dominant theme of American foreign policy in the 20th century. It was more a sophisticated approach to imperialism than the traditional empire building of Europe. William Appleman Williams, in The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, says, "This national argument is usually interpreted as a battle between imperialists led by Roosevelt and Lodge and anti-imperialists led by William Jennings Bryan and Carl Schurz. It is far more accurate and illuminating, however, to view it as a three-cornered fight. The third group was a coalition of businessmen, intellectuals, and politicians who opposed traditional colonialism and advocated instead a policy of open door through which America's preponderant economic strength would enter and dominate all underdeveloped areas of the world." However, this preference on the part of some business groups and politicians for what Williams calls the idea of informal empire without war was always subject to change. If peaceful imperialism turned out to be impossible, military action might be needed. Popular support for the Cuban Revolution was based on the thought that, like the Americans of 1776, they were fighting a war for their own liberation. There seems to have been another kind of fear. The U.S. government, however, the conservative product of another revolutionary war, had the power and profit in mind as it observed the events in Cuba. Neither Cleveland, president during the first years of the Cuban Revolt, nor McKinley, who followed, recognized the insurgents officially as belligerents. Such legal recognition would have enabled the U.S. to give aid to the rebels without sending an army. But there may have been fear that the rebels would win on their own and keep the U.S. out. Always an ulterior motive. Always. There seems to have also been another kind of fear. The Cleveland administration said a Cuban victory might lead to the establishment of a white and black republic. Since Cuba had a mixture of the two races, and the Black Republic might be dominant. They didn't want black people in the United States getting an idea. They didn't want white and black people to get an idea that they could coexist together, especially the poor white and the poor black people. Again, this is a through line throughout every single chapter that we have read, whether it's within the United States or it's overseas. American government and the elite were terrified of black people and white people, whether they spoke English, Spanish, French, Creole, it did not matter. They did not want white and black people mixing. That was a nightmare scenario for them, because if we came together, everything was possible. And the whole point is that they didn't want things to be possible. I'm laughing to keep myself from crying. It's not funny. This idea was expressed in 1896 in an article in the Saturday Review by a young and eloquent imperialist whose mother was American and whose father was English, Winston Churchill. A grave danger represents itself. 2/5 of the insurgents in the field are Negroes. These men would, in the event of success, demand a preponderant share in the government of the country, the result being, after years of fighting, another Black Republic. So let's briefly talk about Haiti. Because of the revolution that happened in Haiti, all of these white governments, whether it was in Europe, in the United States, all of them were terrified that the black people that they were oppressing would be inspired by the success of the revolution that was led by enslaved people in Haiti. It says here, the reference to another Black Republic meant Haiti, whose revolution against France in 1803 had led to the first nation run by blacks in the New World. The Spanish minister to the United States wrote to the United States Secretary of State, "In this revolution, the Negro element has been the most important part. Not only the principal leaders are colored men, but at least 8/10 of their supporters. And the result of the war, if the island can be declared independent, will be a secession of the Black element and a Black republic. As Philip Foner says in his 2-volume study, The Spanish-Cuban-American War, the McKinley administration had plans for dealing with the Cuban situation, but these did not include independence for the island. The U.S. government gained support within America because it told Americans that they were going to be going to war with Spain. The construction is horrible, I'm sorry, but I gotta keep going. They convinced the American people that they wanted to go to war to help people fight for their independence, but on the inside, people knew, like on the inside in terms of government, they knew that their plan was not actually independence for the island. They just needed to say that in order to get people to go put their bodies on the line in order to fight for the concept of freedom and independence. Foner explains the rush of the McKinley administration into war. Its ultimatum gave Spain little time to negotiate by the fact that if the United States waited too long, the Cuban revolutionary forces would emerge victorious, replacing the collapsing Spanish regime. So basically, they did not want the revolutionaries to actually lead the government of their own country. They wanted to interfere and get in there before the revolutionaries could form their own future without the United States and their intervention. That's why they acted so quickly, because the last thing that they wanted was for Cuba to be free. And so I just want those of you who are Cuban, Cuban American, who are super, super patriotic to understand that the people that were really meant to lead Cuba, the people who fought for the independence of Cuba from Spain, were never given the chance to create the Cuban future. Everything that we know now, everything that we see now in Cuba, has been influenced by the United States. We have never seen a version of Cuba that has been able to express itself and develop organically with the leaders within the country, because the United States has always interfered. Whether it's been Cuba, whether it's been Puerto Rico, whether it's been Dominican Republic, it's something that we need to keep in mind, okay? Particularly for those of you who are Cuban and who have really, really leaned into that patriotic narrative that, as we know now, has been by design. Both McKinley and the business community began to see that their object, to get Spain out of Cuba, could not be accomplished without war, and that their accompanying object, the securing of American military and economic influence in Cuba, could not be left to the Cuban rebels, but could be ensured only by U.S. intervention. The New York Commercial Advertiser, at first against war, by March 10th, asked intervention in Cuba for humanity and love of freedom, and above all, the desire that the commerce and industry of every part of the world shall have full freedom of development in the whole world's interest. Before this, Congress had passed the Teller Amendment, pledging the United States not to annex Cuba. It was initiated and supported by those people who were interested in Cuban independence and opposed to American imperialism, and also by business people who saw the open door as sufficient and military intervention unnecessary. But by the spring of 1898, the business community had developed a hunger for action. The Journal of Commerce said the Teller Amendment must be interpreted in a sense somewhat different from that which its author intended it to bear. There were special interests in who would benefit directly from war. In Pittsburgh, center of the iron industry, the Chamber of Commerce advocated force. The Chattanooga tradesman said that the possibility of war has decidedly stimulated the iron trade. Russell Sage, the banker, said that if war came, there is no question as to where the rich men stand. A survey of businessmen said that John Jacob Astor, William Rockefeller, and Thomas Fortune Ryan were feeling militant, and J.P. Morgan believed further talk with Spain would accomplish nothing. On March 25th, a telegram arrived at the White House from an advisor to McKinley saying, "Big corporations here now believe we will have war. Believe all would welcome it as a relief to suspense." 2 days after getting this telegram, McKinley presented an ultimatum to Spain, demanding an armistice. So a spokesman for the Cuban rebels, who was based in New York, heard about McKinley presenting an ultimatum to Spain, which at no point acknowledged independence for Cuba, to which he responded to the United States, to President McKinley, by saying, "In the face of the present proposal of intervention without previous recognition of independence, it is necessary for us to go a step further and say that we must and will regard such an intervention as nothing less than a declaration of war by the U.S. against Cuban revolutionists." Indeed, when McKinley asked Congress for war on April 11th, he did not recognize the rebels as belligerents or ask for Cuban independence. 9 days later, Congress, by joint resolution, gave McKinley the power to intervene. When American forces moved into Cuba, the rebels welcomed them, hoping the Teller Amendment would guarantee Cuban independence. Many histories of the Spanish-American War have said that public opinion in the U.S. led McKinley to declare war on Spain and send forces to Cuba. True, certain influential newspapers had been pushing hard, even hysterically, and many Americans, seeing the aim of intervention as Cuban independence and with the Teller Amendment as a guarantee of this intention, supported the idea. But would McKinley have gone to war because of the press and some portion of the public without urging of the business community? American labor unions had sympathy for the Cuban rebels as soon as the insurrection against Spain began in 1895, but they opposed American expansionism. Both the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor spoke against the idea of annexing Hawaii, which McKinley proposed in 1897. Despite the feeling for the Cuban rebels, a resolution calling for U.S. intervention was defeated at the 1897 convention of the AFL. Samuel Gompers of the AFL wrote to a friend, "The sympathy of our movement with Cuba is genuine, earnest, and sincere, but this does not for a moment imply that we are committed to certain adventurers who are apparently suffering from hysteria." Socialists opposed the war. One exception was the Jewish Daily Forward. The People, newspaper of the Socialist Party, called the issue of Cuban freedom a pretext and said the government wanted war to distract the attention of the workers from their real interests. The Appeal to Reason, another socialist newspaper, said the movement for war was a favorite method of rulers for keeping the people from redressing domestic wrongs. In the San Francisco Voice of Labor, a socialist wrote, "It is a terrible thing to think that the poor workers of this country should be sent to kill and wound the poor workers of Spain merely because a few leaders may incite them to do so." On May Day, 1898, the Socialist Labor Party organized an anti-war parade in New York City, but the authorities would not allow it to take place. While a May Day parade called by the Jewish Daily Forward urging Jewish workers to support the war was permitted. The Chicago Labor World said, "This has been a poor man's war, paid for by the poor man. The rich have profited by it, as they always do." The Spanish forces were defeated in 3 months in what John Hay, the American Secretary of State, later called a splendid little war. The American military pretended that the Cuban rebel army did not exist. When the Spanish surrendered, no Cuban was allowed to confer on the surrender or sign it. General William Schaefer said no armed rebels could enter the city of Santiago and told the Cuban rebel leader, General Calixto Garcia, that not Cubans but the old Spanish civil authorities would remain in charge of the municipal offices in Santiago. American historians have generally ignored the role of the Cuban rebels in the war. Can you imagine? You fight for your country's freedom against a colonial government, only for another colonial government to come intervene. You do all of this only for Spain and for the United States to agree on the terms of your supposed independence. The Lumbermen's Review, spokesman for the lumber industry, said in the midst of the war, "The moment Spain drops the reins of government in Cuba, the moment will arrive for American lumber interests to move into the island for the products of Cuban forests. Cuba still possesses 10 million acres of virgin forest abounding in valuable timber, nearly every foot of which would be saleable in the United States and bring high prices." Americans began taking over railroad, mine, and sugar properties when the war ended. In a few years, 30 million of the American capital was invested. United Fruit moved into the Cuban sugar industry. It bought 1.9 million acres of land for about 20 cents an acre. The American Tobacco Company arrived. By the end of the occupation in 1901, Foner estimates that at least 80% of the export of Cuba's minerals were in American hands, mostly by Bethlehem Steel. The United States did not annex Cuba, but a Cuban Constitutional Convention was told that the United States Army would not leave Cuba until the Platt Amendment, passed by Congress in February 1901, was incorporated into the new Cuban Constitution. This amendment gave the United States the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of government, adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. It also provided for the United States to get coaling or naval stations at certain specified points. At this point, there were a lot of Americans and a lot of Cubans who believed that American interventionism was happening because the Americans genuinely had the well-being of the Cubans at the top of everything. That was supposedly the main reason that they went in there, was for the prosperity and for the well-being of Cuban people. But as you and I know, it's always about money. I genuinely feel like I'm draining as I read these pages right now because this is insane. We only have like 5 pages left, so I'm gonna make it through, but this is impacting me. This is making my anxiety fester. It's just fuck, man. Like, these people don't change. They just don't change. The Teller Amendment and the talk of Cuban freedom before and during the war led many Americans and Cubans to expect genuine independence. The Platt Amendment was now seen not only by the radical and labor press, but by newspapers and groups all over the United States as a betrayal. A mass meeting of the American Anti-Imperialist League at Faneuil Hall in Boston denounced it. Ex-Governor George Boutwell saying, "In disregard of our pledge of freedom and sovereignty to Cuba, we are imposing on that island conditions of colonial vassalage." In Havana, a torchlight procession of 15,000 Cubans marched on the Constitutional Convention, urging them to reject the amendment. But General Leonard Wood, head of the occupation forces, assured McKinley, "The people of Cuba lend themselves readily to all sorts of demonstrations and parades, and little significance should be attached to them." A committee was delegated by the Constitutional Convention to reply to the United States' insistence that the Platt Amendment be included in the Constitution. The committee report, Venencia a la Convención, was written by a black delegate from Santiago. It said, "The only Cuban governments that would live would be those which count on the support and benevolence of the United States, and the clearest result of this situation would be that we would only have feeble and miserable governments condemned to live more attentive to obtaining the blessings of the United States than to serving and defending the interests of Cuba." For the United States to reserve to itself the power to determine when this independence was threatened, and when, therefore, it should intervene to preserve it, is equivalent to handing over the keys to our house so that they can enter it at any time, whenever the desire seizes them, day or night, whether with good or evil design. The report termed the request for coaling or naval stations as a mutilation of the fatherland. It concluded, "A people occupied militarily is being told that before consulting their own government, before being free in their own territory, they should grant the military occupants, who came as friends and allies, rights and powers which would annul the sovereignty of these very people. That it is the situation created for us by the method which the United States has just adopted. It could not be more obnoxious and inadmissible." With this report, the convention overwhelmingly rejected the Platt Amendment. Within the next 3 months, however, the pressure from the United States, the military occupation, the refusal to allow the Cubans to set up their own government until they acquiesced, the convention, after several refusals, adopted the Platt Amendment. You know, this is why the situation between the US and Cuba is so important to analyze, because it is not what it looks like. There's so much more. There's so much more. And I will tell you this as somebody who grew up in Miami around a lot of Cubans who had a very, very, very limited perspective about the United States and its relationship to Cuba. I'm not going to get into it right now because I don't want a bunch of people going after me in the comments, but I will be talking about it over on Patreon. Cuba was thus brought into the American sphere, but not as an outright colony. However, the Spanish-American War did lead to a number of direct annexations by the United States. Puerto Rico, a neighbor of Cuba in the Caribbean belonging to Spain, was taken over by U.S. military forces. The Hawaiian Islands, 1/3 of the way across the Pacific, which had already been penetrated by American missionaries and pineapple plantation owners, had been described by American officials as a ripe pear ready to be plucked, was annexed by joint resolution of Congress in July 1898. Around the same time, Wake Island, 2,300 miles west of Hawaii, on the route to Japan, was occupied, and Guam, the Spanish possession in the Pacific, almost all the way to the Philippines, was taken. In February 1899, The Filipinos rose in revolt against American rule, as they had rebelled several times against the Spanish. Emilio Aguinaldo, a Filipino leader who had been earlier brought back from China by U.S. warships to lead soldiers against Spain, now became leader of the insurrectos fighting the United States. He proposed Filipino independence within a U.S. protectorate, but this was rejected. It took the United States 3 years to crush the rebellion using 70,000 troops, 4 times as many as were landed in Cuba, and thousands of battle casualties, many more times than in Cuba. It was a harsh war. For the Filipinos, the death rate was enormous, from battle casualties and from disease. The taste of empire was on the lips of politicians and business interests throughout the country now. Racism, paternalism, and the talk of money mingled with the talk of destiny and civilization. The fighting with the rebels began, McKinley said, when the insurgents attacked American forces, but later American soldiers testified that the United States had fired the first shot. After the war, an army officer speaking in Boston's Faneuil Hall said that his colonel had given him orders to provoke a conflict with the insurgents in the Philippines. In February 1899, a banquet took place in Boston to celebrate the Senate's ratification of the peace treaty with Spain. President McKinley himself had been invited by the wealthy textile manufacturer W.B. Plunkett to speak. It was the biggest banquet in the nation's history, 2,000 diners, 400 waiters. McKinley said that no imperial designs lurk in the American mind. And at the same banquet to the same diners, his postmaster, General Charles Emory Smith, said that what we want is a market for our surplus. So William James, a Harvard philosopher, was part of a movement of prominent American businessmen, politicians, and intellectuals who formed the Anti-Imperialist League in 1898 and carried on a long campaign to educate the American public about the horrors of the Philippine War and the evils of imperialism. It was an odd group, which Andrew Carnegie was a part of, including anti-labor aristocrats and scholars united in a common moral outrage at what was being done to the Filipinos in the name of freedom. Whatever their differences on other matters, they would all agree with William James's angry statement, "God damn the U.S. for its vile conduct in the Philippine Isles." A volunteer from the state of Washington wrote, "Our fighting blood was up, and we wanted to kill hard N-word. This shooting human beings beats rabbit hunting all to pieces." Quite frankly, this is overwhelming me right now. I'm feeling really hot and I just feel really sensitive, and so I just need to get through this chapter before I start crying. It was a time of intense racism in the United States. In the years between 1889 and 1903, on the average, every week, 2 Negroes were lynched by mobs, hanged, burned, and mutilated. The Filipinos were brown-skinned, physically identifiable, strange-speaking, and strange-looking to Americans. To the usual indiscriminate brutality of war was thus added the factor of racial hostility. In Manila, a Marine named Littletown Waller, a major, was accused of shooting 11 defenseless Filipinos without trial on the island of Samar. Other Marine officers described his testimony. The major said that General Smith instructed him to kill and burn, and said that the more he killed and burned, the better pleased he would be, that it was no time to take prisoners, that he was to make Samar a howling wilderness. Major Waller asked General Smith to define the age limit killing, and he replied, everything over 10. This is the same military that were begging to stop bombing Palestine. A military that years ago was doing the very thing in the Philippines and across the world. The reason I feel like I'm overwhelmed right now is because these people, I don't know, man, I don't even know what to say. I actually don't even know how to describe my overwhelm or how to process this right now. Despite the growing evidence of brutality and the work of the Anti-Imperialist League, some of the trade unions in the U.S. supported the action in the Philippines. The typographical union said it liked the idea of annexing more territory because English language schools in those areas would help the printing trade. Some unions repeated what big business was saying, that territorial expansion by creating a market for surplus goods would prevent another depression. Okay, this is the last video for chapter 12. I'm sorry if I'm coming across not enthusiastic. It's just, I'm a person, I feel things, and this is energetically draining. It's also incensing and it's enraging that so much is just the same. So much is still the same. And I know we're reading this in order to better make sense of the present day, but it's like the more I learn, the more I see that this is all by design, and the more I realize that so much about everything is an illusion, and so much about everything that is painful and hurtful and horrible to humanity is related to money and power. Just entrenched in every vessel and vein. I'm about to cry and I just don't want to, because I really, really want to just read the last 2 pages. Let's get through this, Cat. Let's get through this. We can do it. So remember that at this time, Black people, regardless of whether they were fighting in wars, they would come back and still be treated like shit. It says here, these Black boys, heroes of our country, were not allowed to stand at the counters of restaurants and eat a sandwich and drink a cup of coffee, while the white soldiers were welcomed and invited to sit down at the tables and eat free of cost. Oh man, this is enraging. This is enraging. This is enraging. And you know, there are people in the comments who are like, stop reading this is not good for you spiritually or whatever. And like, I am one of those people that I would rather know, but this is definitely taking a toll on me energetically. And so just know that after I read this, I have a whole spiritual hygiene routine that I have to implement, because I refuse to allow my energy and my light to be used up as just anger. Like, I have to preserve myself and I have to remain intact so that I can continue reading this, continue moving forward and being a part of the change that our world so desperately needs. But this definitely requires you to gather yourself spiritually and energetically afterward, because this is the kind of shit that will make you dissociate from reality and not want to participate in anything. It was the Filipino situation that aroused many Blacks in the United States to militant opposition to the war. The senior bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Henry M. Turner, called the campaign in the Philippines an unholy war of conquest and referred to the Filipinos as sable patriots. There were 4 Black regiments on duty in the Philippines. Many of the Black soldiers established rapport with the brown-skinned natives on the islands and were angered by the term hard N-word. An unusually large number of Black troops deserted during the Philippines campaign, Gatewood says. The Filipino rebels often addressed themselves to the colored American soldier in posters reminding them of the lynchings back home, asking them not to serve the white imperialists against other colored people. Some deserters joined the Filipino rebels. The most famous of these was David Fagan of the 24th Infantry. According to Gatewood, he accepted a commission in the insurgent army and for 2 years wreaked havoc upon the American forces. From the Philippines, William Sims wrote, "I was struck by a question a little Filipino boy asked me, which ran about this way. Why does the American Negro come to fight us where we are much a friend to him and have not done anything to him? He is all the same as me, and me as all the same as you. Why don't you fight those people in America who burn Negroes, then make a beast of you?" Another soldier's letter of 1899. Our racial sympathies would naturally be with the Filipinos. They are fighting manfully for what they conceive to be their best interests, but we cannot, for the sake of sentiment, turn our back upon our own country. A Black infantryman named William Fulbright wrote from Manila in June 1901 to the editor of a paper in Indianapolis. The struggle on the islands has been naught but a gigantic scheme of robbery and oppression. The patience, industry, and moderation preached to Blacks, the patriotism preached to whites, did not fully sink in. In the first years of the 20th century, despite all the demonstrated power of the state, large numbers of Blacks, whites, men, women became impatient, immoderate, and unpatriotic. That's it. That's the end of chapter 12. I don't know what to say anymore. I say that after every single chapter, but I genuinely don't know what to say. I'm going to go light some incense, drink some water, go for a walk, and journal. That's what I'm gonna do, because this chapter really stirred up some things in me, and I need to go settle my spirit. So thank you for being here, sending you all a big hug, and I'll see you for chapter 13, which is titled The Socialist Challenge. Also, we are about halfway through this book. It is page 321, and we have 682 pages, so we're almost halfway, and yeah, I keep encouraging you to read and to lean in, even though this shit is very, very uncomfortable.